Welcome to Horror Bytes on Safe Room, the show where we discuss the smaller scares and teenier terrors available to play on your gaming devices. From 5-minute prototypes to tantalizing demos and ambitious small-scale games, Horror Bytes aim to celebrate all kinds of terrifying micro-monsters in the indie horror gaming space, with 2 games in each episode picked for a particular theme. I'm your host, Neil Bolt, and can't even say my name. And joining me in this endeavor, as ever, is Jay Krieger. How you doing, Jay?
I'm doing well, man. I've gotten my sitting out for the week, so hopefully this will be a little bit of a more holy finale to our recent theme.
Indeed. Yes, we are back with our second and final episode for our latest theme, where Jay has brought us Divine Rejection. As Jay said in the previous episode, we can pick small horror games, concepts, game jams, and the like with a religious horror flavour. Last time out, Jay delivered us from evil with Tooth and Claws on Viennese, while I invoked the wrath of God by consuming selfish dreams, the flesh of fallen angels. For this episode, Jay returns to the themes of religious cults with his pick, so Jay, please spread the gospel of Sagebrush for our flock.
Yeah, so Sagebrush is a game from developer and publisher Redact Games and the lead developer Nate Behrens. And this is a religious horror game that abides by the sort of genre that and I know that you are both, we are both fans of, that being, the walking simulator, even if, that sort of like description there within has a certain connotation to it. I think that, as an example of like walking simulators that utilize genre tropes to tell their narratives, like Sagebrush ended up being a pretty strong example of that for me, for the reasons we'll get into. But yeah, for Sagebrush, it has the player exploring a cult compound of the Black Sage Ranch, which is a New Mexico cult whose congregation collectively took their lives shortly before the player arrives there. And as I said, it's a walking simulator, so it has you exploring various locations on the ranch, such as like, school, chapel, community hall, a mine, and various other notable landmarks, each of which has clues that kind of like fill in the blanks of the overall sort of like reasons and the lead up to that mass, suicidal event that occurred there and whatnot. So the elements of this game that I'll sort of like skip past because, they're elements that we've seen a fair amount of times, is that this is very much sort of that lo-fi PSX kind of a graphical aesthetic that, harkens back to this older style of gameplay and whatnot. In terms of it being the sort of like walking simulator subgenre, your time is spent basically doing a series of fetch quests. You got to find some keys, you're going to find journal entries and various tape recordings and testimonials from people that were part of that congregation. All of that is fairly familiar to anybody that's played a walking simulator, anybody that has played these kinds of like PSX style experiences. That's not a knock. That's just, the aspects of this game that didn't necessarily stand out to me. And I'm sure to a degree they didn't for you as well, given, the amount of these types of games we've played, structurally speaking. What I did find really remarkable about Sagebrush is the fact that, for not only the previous games that we covered in our episode of Horror Bytes, covering religious horror games, but like religious horror games in general, I think a lot of those games kind of like subscribe and facilitate the usual route that religious horror games take, which is a lot of like demonic imagery. There's a lot of imagery of like churches burning and, crosses burning and these types of things that are fairly familiar. However, the aspect of Sagebrush that I found to be the most remarkable was it's sort of, just generally speaking, depiction of cults in a way that I found to be pretty grounded, in a way that was quite effective. The sort of like exposing of cults and the notion of like a lot of cults that kind of dabble in this us versus them mentality, the ways in which they recruit people that are dealing with various types of trauma. Like our protagonist in this game finds themselves at this sort of crossroads in their life. She graduates college. She doesn't have a job or a real viable path to what her future looks like. Her relationship ends just at that pivotal moment, and she finds herself in this vulnerable space. And then, she meets this woman Anne at a bus stop, and the sort of like the way that the dialogue unfolds and the ways in which they depict this cult that again is like this sort of doomsday cult for what I assumed was going to be sort of a general genre game. It was depicted in a manner that I found to be really disturbing just because of just how authentic it felt. Not that I have a lot of my own personal experience with cults, but I think that what this does so well is that it makes it very plausible that someone could find themselves in a situation like this, like to varying degrees, like who hasn't found themselves in a vulnerable place in life. And imagine if at your most vulnerable moment, someone came to you and said, I have all the answers. There's a bit of dialogue right at the beginning of this. And I think it's even in the trailer for the game, but it's really a fantastic primer for the protagonist and ultimately the player's journey in exploring sagebrush. In that, and I'll just read it because I have the quote here, and it's from the protagonist, and she says, like, I met Anne first waiting for the bus. I asked her what she was selling, and she laughed and said, nothing at all. That what she had to offer was free for anyone who wanted it bad enough. I asked her what had helped her. And then she goes into like, it's this pastor of this cult church and whatnot. But like that gets expanded on in the dialogue and in the various writings and diary entries that the player finds. And it really like describes this notion of people that have this hole in their life. And all of a sudden this person comes out of the woodwork and says, I had a hole in my life as well. And that was, this, that, or the other that was missing from it. And yet in joining this group, I found that hole was filled with whatever this organization is and whatnot. And like, I don't know, I found that sort of like very grounded depiction before the game gets into any of its maybe more supernatural aspects or the sort of supernatural presentation. Not that there's a great deal of it. Like, I found that to be very moving in a way where it was like, it really captures the vulnerability of individuals, again, like at the lowest moments in their life. The notion that this person has essentially offering you your own salvation. And, that's obviously heavily layered in manipulation and the notion that you're being exploited. But, it was sort of like the down-to-earth depiction of whether it's religion or some other kind of group that's like essentially a cult. I found that to be a lot more disturbing and sort of just uncomfortable than any sort of like supernatural depiction of religious horror that we've experienced thus far with our theme for Horror Bytes.
Yeah, and what's funny about this is it's the rare opportunity of me being ahead of the curve for this one because I reviewed this for Bloody Disgusting back in 2018. Would you believe?
Oh, jeez, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's one of the first few things I did review, which obviously predates doing Horror Bites as well. But yeah, no, and I was curious coming back to it to see if I'd feel the same as I did back then, and it turns out generally I did, and I agree that, as you're saying there, it's like the fact that don't come here looking for some great big twist to it. It's basically the story of the aftermath of something horrible happening and why these people chose to get into this situation, which is this alternative to religion as a standard sort of religion. Yeah, and that in itself makes for a fascinating sort of storytelling piece. I think the audio and the text that comes up for the stories is really strong in terms of like giving you an idea of why these people do this and why they would join it and how the cult sort of leaned into the idea of where regular religion sort of goes wrong to get to this point. And in this New Mexico sort of environment as well, the ambience is wonderful for even with the obviously with the low poly graphics. It just looks like quite sparse. Like you feel like the isolation and like the emptiness of it in that sense.
Mm,
What for me didn't gel at the time, and still I think it's the same, especially with all these games that we've played since, is that the two things don't connect. I think
mm,
there's no real storytelling in the world itself. It's all very much done through the audio and the text. Like it's the world, the compound itself feels quite sparse. No, not enough signs of like what was there before, which is fine. I think that the story still gets told. It's I think because we've had so many games of all shapes and sizes in the years since that have done something like that.
mm.
But yeah, it does just sort of stick out like a sore thumb in that regard. But I think, as you said, considering it's not traditional horror in that sense, it is very much like more of a realistic horror in terms of people just will be swayed by these things and such tragedies can happen. And it is so tragic to hear certain stories about why these people get in, and then knowing obviously what happened to them before you even
Mm.
by the time you hear the story. Um, yeah, it's a fun little game in that regard, if you call it that. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it at the time. Despite its sort of flaws in terms of marrying like the visual and the audio sides of things. Yeah, it's one that still stuck with me. I think despite that because it's so unique in its premise.
I think that's the best way to put it in that, it's maybe in terms of being an actual, like the game aspect of it, it's not really like anything you haven't experienced before if you've ever played a walking simulator. Like it's very, if you will, fetch quest heavy, right? It's like you're running around, you're finding keys to progress your progression through this world. Um, and so from that aspect, it's like if the mystery and sort of the, I suppose, getting a little bit more context or getting more insight into what occurred
Mm,
doesn't jive with you early on, like, sure, it's not going to be your type of game. And, not that there's an overwhelming amount of negative reviews on Steam, but at the same time, like the only negative ones I've seen, people talk about like not capitalizing on its potential or it's not much fun to play. Like, I don't know, with these types of games at this point, I just have this mindset of like, I'm not going into this like I'm expecting to have, quote unquote fun or a traditional type of experience. It's like, no, like it's an interesting premise. And I think something that you touched upon that certainly rings true for me is like the production value in terms of the writing and the voiceovers for those characters and whatnot. I think is of a caliber that like it really sells me on the narrative aspect of this, which is
mm,
why I think, for me, I really appreciated this in the same way I appreciated Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, which is another game that is not fun to play, but it presents an interesting premise. It introduces a sort of mystery box aspect to it. And again, like the production value is quite strong in the ways in which it chooses to delve into the narrative of that game. And so for those same reasons, like Sagebrush, not traditional horror, but there's a lot of real world horror here that I found to be effective, even if, outside of maybe only one scene of this that I can really remember,
mm.
it has anything along the lines of like traditional horror in terms of visuals and whatnot. But, for a game that's less than $10, it'll take you, for me, it was about an hour, probably stand to spend about 90 minutes with this. It's a short and sweet one for me, but it's one that I think gives us another component of horror and religious horror that is going to stick with me for a while.
Yeah, which is fair enough. Though. If a game can do that for you, that says a lot, I think. But we will be back at the pulpit with our second pick right after this. Welcome back. So, for my pick, we have Catherine's and several others classic survival horror short, The Devil. In this game, you are a transient who now finds themselves aboard a ship known as the Spire, hoping to find a way home. But of course, it's not that simple, and the Spire ends up veering way off course, accidentally venturing into an accursed swampland. The Spire soon then has to stop when one of its number goes overboard, and lucky you, you'll be going to try and find them. As a premise and a setup for a survival horror game, that sounds wonderful in itself, and it is a very traditional, classic survival horror. It was originally a submission to the haunted PS1 Summer of Screams, and yes, it is very much evoking that classic style, but it has plenty going for it that really made it stand out for me. All the things I mentioned in that sort of story, this is a world of its own, in terms of what it's doing. The ship is, has some sort of weird community thing going on about it, and the world is definitely in some sort of strange place. So first, I think is like the character models for me, which are an interesting pick for that sort of style. When we looked at games like Pro Country, where they went for almost a JRPG style 3D character model in a survival horror environment. This isn't too far off that. I would liken it more to like old action figure sort of style character models where they're very chunky and squat, and that lends a real kind of personality which I think otherwise would have been very different given the locations. Yeah, the second thing is the locations. Very brutalist sort of style, very lots of greys, not much color at all in this world. If it's not industrial, it's brutalist, and it's just generally very stark and desolate, but very striking with it. Very lots of high walls, and when light does hit this grayness, it really like has a great effect on it. I think you really get the mood and the atmosphere straight away. So it's initially got this great build up, I think. Very intriguing sort of world building in terms of just giving you an idea of like your relationship to the people on this ship, the Spire, and like what could be wrong with these swamps. People are already talking about the terrible things that could be out here, but no one really knows, and you do eventually stumble upon what that is. That's when it starts to become a more sort of traditional survival horror game. You have ammo that is limited. You can find a lot of it, but but the enemies that you have to face are quite numerous as well. So with that, yes, the enemies can swarm you in certain environments, and it's better to flee. When you do shoot, there's a handy sort of trajectory line for bullets to sort of know exactly where you're shooting at. But sort of offsetting that is that your gun is a hodgepodge thing, and it can just jam in the middle of combat, which is the displayed like many of the things in this game in text below you to sort of suggest what's going on, whether you're in danger or there's something happening. And in that case, you don't miss that, and it sends you into a kind of panic straight away, I think, which is useful for a survival horror game. I think for me, I think for me it's just the way this game built up its world in 50 minutes or so, and managed to sort of do so much and establish itself as something unique, considering like the environments are so just stock standard bleak looking things that have very little detail, but like the shapes are interesting in how they're used, I think. And it's effective. I think that there's been more sort of reliance on getting the storytelling and the world building done in this sort of short slab of a game that kind of offsets any sort of limitations you might have. And everything about it just has a distinct style, which when you are using the sort of PS1, PSX sort of visual tool set, that's hard to do. So it's fascinating that it does kind of make you think in like modern terms of stuff like Crow County, because it does kind of do similar things, like in terms of like a background of an abandoned place and the things like that. But that's survival horror in a lot of cases too. And I really enjoyed it for what it was, and I was quite impressed that they managed to make something so short feel quite well paced, throughout as well, which I think for a survival horror is very difficult as well. So how about you though?
Yeah, for me, I think the ways in which that this game really succeeds is in its presentation. Now, it's notable that we arrived at the Devil afterwards when it had a pretty substantial anniversary update that included things like split screen co-op, which either one of us was able to experience, but
No.
they reworked some of the dialogue improvements in terms of like functionality and just presentation in AI, but also, and I think it's probably the best component of that update, that being the new camera angles. Because for me, like, I mean, and I'm sure to a degree you'll agree, like, I mean, how many survival horror games have we played at this point in our respective lives between the years that we share with one another? Like, it's just like, yeah, at this point, I've played so many of these survival horror games that either claim to be or just based on how they look, like want to harken back to the, if you will, the tentpole franchises that we've talked ad nauseum about. But here, like, the variety of camera angles is so well utilized, I think, in taking this brutalist, this like monolithic brutalist structure that you're exploring. That's not terribly unlike In Control, right? This notion of this mega structure that you can't explain it, and the ways in which its architecture takes these twists and turns is part of the mystery that I love so much about games such as this. But like, really, the dynamic camera perspectives, they present some of the environments from a top-down perspective. Some of them are the camera pushed out super far, like you're playing a Little Nightmares or something. Some of them are super close up. Some of them are a 2D side-scrolling sort of perspective. And like, that aspect of the presentation of the world does so much heavy lifting, I think, in terms of communicating to players the fact that you're exploring this weird world that you might not really get a lot of answers to. But I think that the presentation is just as remarkable in terms of establishing, like, this is a supernatural place, regardless of the sorts of denizens of the structure that you'll find and have to fight at certain points. Like, I'm all about the presentation of this game and the fact that, when you get into combat in some instances, or you get into these moments where you have to like pick up specific items in an environment, it transitions to like that third person over the shoulder aspect. So like, it's indicative of developers and creatives that like really truly understand the importance of perspective in establishing a sense of space, but then at the same time cutting away to moments that or I suppose perspectives that are more indicative of like impressing upon players, okay, this is when some gameplay is going to happen. So you need this perspective to like not become overly frustrated with maybe a combat heavy portion of an experience. So for me, like, this was one of those games that really, truly showed an understanding of that. And, the mechanics for the survival horror aspect are like, I'm not going to say they're like overly simplistic. They're pretty straightforward, but I think it really just boils down to like the ways in which this game is presented to others is its greatest strength, and kind of like is that notch that takes it a peg above however many other survival horror classic PSX homages we've played. Because it really just seems like they perfectly understood, like, okay, this moment is to impress upon the player that the scale of this base or this ship or this facility is like the important thing we're trying to stress here. But then at the same time, oh, you have to get into some combat. We're not going to make that overly frustrating for the player. So I think it's just a really smart approach to design, and one that makes me want to check out, their other various projects that they've dabbled in.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find links to the games in this episode in the episode description, of course, as well. But that is all we have for this week, and we will be back in a couple of weeks with a new theme. But thank you again, Jay, for talking about these horror games with me. And if you, the listener, do have a short horror game demo, game jam entry, or proof of concept that you think we should be highlighting, or maybe you just want to suggest a new theme for some episodes, Jay here will show you exactly how you can do that.
Yeah, so if you have games to suggest, you want to leave us some feedback. Hopefully it's going to be, if it's criticism, along the lines of constructive at that. You can follow us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Blue Sky, YouTube, Instagram, at Safe Room Pod. At the same time, you want to send us an email, you can reach out to us at saferoompod@gmail.com for all of those, recommendations, compliments, or, as I said, constructive criticisms.
Yes, no flaming bricks or anything like that, please. We will be back with 2 more small-scale horror games and a brand new theme in 2 weeks' time.